The arrival of the Trailblazers colonisation update to Elite Dangerous fundamentally changed one of the game's major gameplay loops, a feature that has been, for many players, a cornerstone of their Elite Dangerous experience. That feature was the manipulation of the background simulation that is used to control the ebb and flow of influence and thereby the movement and expansion of minor factions in the Elite Dangerous galaxy. Manipulation of the background simulation, or BGS as it is known, in order to expand the influence of a minor faction in the game, in particular player owned minor factions or PMFs, is something that I've spoken about on this channel a couple of times, but as a gameplay system it is something that often isn't widely recognised or engaged with outside of squadron based gameplay. So for the uninitiated, here's a brief explanation. When you browse the station menu at a starport or walk around its interior, you'll notice that there are a number of factions represented. The vast majority of these factions are generated by the game, however some of them have been generated by the player base and injected into the game by Frontier. It is possible for a player squadron to officially support and affiliate themselves to one of these minor factions in the game. Whenever any player attempts or completes a mission for one of these factions or performs an action in the space owned by a faction, it can then have a measurable effect on the influence levels of the faction within that star system. Those influence levels can be driven up or down depending on the nature of the mission or the action performed. Raising or lowering a faction's influence can bring them into conflicts with other factions in the system, which is how wars and elections etc spring up, and increasing a faction's influence high enough in a given system can cause that faction to expand into neighbouring star systems, and so the process recycles, causing factions to spread across populated space. Prior to Trailblazers, in order for a faction to expand into a system, that system needed to have both a population within it already as well as assets such as starports etc that could be claimed. Historically in Elite Dangerous, BGS manipulation and faction expansion has formed a huge amount of squadron based gameplay, and expanding your chosen faction into a neighbouring system in a controlled way often required a lot of work and planning. Prior to colonisation, the amount of space that could be expanded into was limited, and player groups often jostled and bargained for the space needed to grow. In a move that I think largely no one saw coming, all that changed with the arrival of colonisation. Whilst it was, of course, expected that colonisation would naturally bring more populated space for factions to move into, there was one particular feature of colonising a new system that drove a bus through the process of faction expansion that had been the signature feature of so many years before. When you successfully colonise a new star system, regardless of where in the galaxy it is, if you are part of a squadron that supports a player minor faction, then that minor faction also appears in the system that has been colonised. Whereas prior expansion into a new system required careful, planned and targeted BGS manipulation, now, suddenly, anyone could make their faction take up residence in any part of populated space with very minimal effort. To all intents and purposes, the BGS manipulation and expansion gameplay of old, whilst not gone, was largely irrelevant overnight. Instead of spending their time wrestling the nuances and quirks of the multi-limbed BGS monster, faction expansion, planning and management now revolves, largely at least, around colonisation, with a given faction's presence randomly appearing potentially anywhere in bubble space with no warning whatsoever. When it comes to the BGS, the game of influence management is, to all intents and purposes, gone, and Trailblazers killed it. The big question is now, why did Frontier take this step? There is no current reason in the game for your faction to follow you personally wherever you choose to colonise. As things stand, it apparently serves no purpose. In fact, an argument could be made that if Frontier planned to support BGS gameplay in its prior form, then this feature of colonisation is entirely the wrong thing to do, as raising influence to force an expansion into a system is actually more difficult than just slapping down an outpost in a neighbouring empty system. It's like FDev are slowly but very deliberately resigning BGS gameplay, as was, to history. If indeed that is the case, what, if anything, replaces it? To dig into an answer for that question, there are some clues and threads that can be pulled on. Firstly, the official Introduction to Colonisation guide that FDev went to the trouble of retweeting this week to remind everyone that it exists contains one fascinating detail of omission within it. The text within the guide says the following about a successful colonisation, quote, "The newly established colony is now an uncontrolled populated star system and is eligible to be expanded into and controlled via power play," end quote. It makes no mention whatsoever of minor factions or BGS. The ability for players to apply to Frontier for minor faction representation in the game was closed in the spring of 2023, around 2 years ago as I speak these words. At the time, the announcement from Frontier, which you can find linked below, stated the following, quote, "Player-made factions have played a key role in expressing your will over the shape of the bubble. This goal is at the heart of our plans for Elite," end quote. The announcement then continued, quote, "Our focus is now turning to investigate how upcoming systems will allow every player and player group to have a meaningful impact on the galaxy's landscape," end quote. There was significant speculation at the time that some kind of base building mechanic might be in the works off the back of that announcement. 18 months later, Trailblazers arrived. But colonisation as a mechanic doesn't replace PMFs. If anything, the Trailblazers update has significantly devalued them at the very least. So what, if anything, will replace them? The next update to the game, aside from ships, is Vanguards, which is due to launch in the summer. Vanguards has been pitched by FDev as a spiritual successor to the current, largely featureless, Squadron system. Vanguards, however, is an unusual moniker for a system that is set to replace Squadrons, if indeed that is the case. From wording Arthur Tolmie used when speaking to FDev's Senior Director of Projects on the Frontier Unlocked livestream at the start of this year, we do know that, currently at least, the update appears to be renaming a squadron to a Vanguard, as Arthur mentioned, specifically players, quote, "joining a Vanguard," unquote. But the dictionary definition of a Vanguard has little in common with a noun that might commonly replace squadron. A squadron is absolutely a divisional military term used to collectively refer to a group of 2 or more people, ships or aircraft, etc. A vanguard is described as a group of people leading the way in a new development or the foremost part of an advancing army or naval force. This is of course a video game, and as such it is not necessarily constrained by things like dictionary definitions, etc, but as a choice of words chosen by the developers and staff working on the feature, I do find it an interesting choice. In a very similar vein, the update that relaunched power play into the game was called Ascendancy, a name that would at first seem to have very little to do with the reality of the day-to-day political ebb and flow of power in the Elite Dangerous galaxy, unless of course you view Power Play 2.0 through the lens of a potential replacement for BGS activities in the game. Then the word Ascendancy takes on a whole new meaning. I'm not saying Power Play 2.0 is definitely being pitched to replace BGS activities in Elite, but the sudden and almost complete devaluing of BGS gameplay via the introduction of a new mechanic, coupled with the obviously very competent and now very well respected rise of power play in the game, does make for some fascinating sideways glances. If you were to introduce such a massive and radical change into the game, a big bang moment where you suddenly replace one for the other would be a shocking and likely very damaging event in the game's life. A slow and gradual transition, however, where one feature is subtly devalued and then replaced, almost by stealth, that I can see being a very logical and wholly less damaging route to take. What then do you give those players who were invested in BGS and the growth of their own faction to do if they choose not to engage and invest in power play? That then could be where the Vanguard steps in, with invested players promoting the expansion, influence and growth of that entity and its goals. The question still remains, however, if a Vanguard is the forefront of an advancing force, where then is that force advancing and for what reason? As Elite Dangerous continues to evolve, it may yet be the case that the remarkable year that was 2024 was just the start of the radical wave of change sweeping across the face of the galaxy. How has Trailblazers affected your in-game faction? Do you believe power play is being pitched to replace BGS, and what features would you like to see from Vanguards? Let us know in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to the channel so that you see all our videos and community posts, and if you'd like to support our work here at the Buur Pit, you can also join us on Patreon. Links to that and everything else we've talked about in this video you'll find linked below. That's it for now. Thanks very much for watching. We very much look forward to seeing you next time.